The morning sun spilled across the cracked asphalt of Mel's roadside diner, casting long shadows that stretched like tired limbs over the worn parking lot. For over 30 years, the modest establishment had served as a pit stop for weary travelers. Moving along Highway 87 in West Texas, inside, the comforting sounds of sizzling bacon, clinking cups, and low murmurs of conversation gave the place its usual rhythm, a rhythm that never skipped a beat. No matter the weather or the year. Sarah Miller moved among the booths with practiced grace, her presence as steady and familiar as the diner's rust-streaked sign out front. At 35, her back carried more than just the trays she served. It bore the silent weight of a past most would never guess. Her dark hair was neatly pulled into a ponytail, and she wore the standard uniform, black slacks and a white button-down shirt with sleeves. She often tugged lower without even realizing it. Despite her efforts, the mottled scars running from her shoulder to her neck and down her left arm resisted concealment. They peeked through, whispering stories strangers could only imagine: house fires, car crashes, tragic accidents. People stared, made up their own versions, and left it at that. But those who speculated didn't know the truth. Her scars weren't born of tragedy, they were forged in bravery. They were remnants of a violent afternoon near Ramadi in 2006, when Army medic Sarah Miller threw herself over a wounded soldier during an IED attack. She saved his life, and in return, lost the future she'd planned. Her military career ended with that explosion, but 17 soldiers went home because of her. Now, 3 years into this quieter life, Sarah served eggs and coffee to truckers, locals, and out-of-towners who passed through without ever knowing who she really was. She never got an order wrong. She brought extra napkins without being asked, smiled at children, and moved with a quiet efficiency that earned her a kind of reserved respect. People didn't ask questions, not anymore. A few still wondered aloud, tossing around theories in whispers, but most had learned to leave well enough alone. In Mel's diner, she wasn't Sergeant Sarah Miller or the recipient of a Bronze Star and a Purple Heart. Here, she was simply the waitress, and that was exactly how she wanted it. The mid-morning lull had just set in when the contractors came through the door, loud, brash, and crude. Their presence disrupted the diner's calm like a stone hitting still water. They were working on a pipeline just outside town and had made Mel's their go-to breakfast spot. Much to Sarah's displeasure, she approached their table with the coffee pot in hand, already bracing herself. "Hey, Scarface," Chad called, loud and unashamed. As she neared, "Try not to spill any on us. Don't want to end up looking like you." Laughter erupted from the table as his buddies joined in. Sarah kept her face blank, her movement steady, pouring the coffee without so much as a glance in their direction. She had long since learned that any reaction only fed their fire. Silence was a shield, dignity her defense. "What happened to you anyway?" Another one chimed in, loud enough for the whole diner to hear. "Car crash, fire, or did someone do that to you on purpose?" Still, Sarah said nothing. She filled their mugs, took their orders, and walked away as though their words didn't land like punches. She had worked through gunfire, chaos, blood, and screams. These men were amateurs in cruelty. Their ignorance didn't scare her, it just saddened her. At a corner booth, an elderly couple shared a glance, uneasy but unwilling to speak. At the counter, a trucker behind a newspaper kept his head low, pretending not to hear. No one ever said anything. That was the way of things now. Quiet tolerance over confrontation. "I bet she can't even smile with all that scar tissue," Chad said, leaning back in his seat, grinning. "Makes sense why she's working in a dump like this. Who else would hire someone who looks like that?" Sarah's hand tightened subtly round the handle of her coffee pot, her expression unmoved. In her mind, she wasn't in the diner anymore. She was back in the field hospital, crouched over a bleeding soldier, pressure on a wound, sweat in her eyes. She thought of those brave kids with wounds deeper than skin, who smiled anyway, who fought to live. They gave her the strength to ignore men like Chad. Then the bell above the door chimed, and a newcomer stepped into the diner. He was in his early 40s, rugged and road-worn, with faded jeans, scuffed boots, and a Marine Corps cap that had seen better days. The way he moved, alert, cautious, with a straight back and scanning eyes, made his background obvious to anyone who knew what to look for. This man had seen war. He carried it like a second skin. Michael Kelly was crossing the country, finally, visiting all the places he'd missed during his years of service. He liked small diners, real food, real coffee. As he stepped inside, he immediately picked up on the tension, the laughter from the contractors, the subtle flinches from the staff, and the woman in the white shirt moving between tables with practiced grace and a quiet pain behind her eyes. She brought the coffee without fanfare. Just a soft coffee. Michael nodded. Please, he replied, studying her. Something about her struck a chord, the set of her jaw, the way her eyes didn't flinch. A memory stirred, not quite fully formed. As she poured, her sleeve slipped slightly, revealing not just the faint edge of a burn scar but something else, a faded tattoo. Michael's eyes narrowed as he caught sight of it. He knew that ink. He had served with men who wore the same mark. The 3rd to 5th Infantry, Ramadi, 2006. And suddenly, he remembered. Not the full story, not yet, but enough. Thank you, he said, voice low and firm, eyes meeting hers. Sarah gave a polite nod, then turned to leave, but the air around the booth had shifted. Something unspoken now lingered there, something deeper than recognition. The quiet past, it seemed, had just walked in from the road. Shifted again. Her sleeve slid just enough to expose the faint outline of the tattoo on her forearm. Michael's eyes locked on it. Partial letters blurred, but unmistakable, sent a jolt through his chest. 3rd to 5th, his breath caught. For anyone else, it might have seemed like a random phrase, but to a soldier who had bled in the dust of Iraq, it meant everything. The 3rd Infantry Division, 5th Brigade Combat Team, one of the most revered units of the war. Decorated, battle-hardened, home to some of the fiercest fighters and finest medics he'd ever known. In an instant, Michael was no longer sitting in a quiet roadside diner. His mind catapulted back to a blistering hot street in Ramadi, 2006. Smoke, gunfire, and the searing pain of shrapnel tearing into his side. An IED had flipped their Humvee. The world had gone sideways. Everything was chaos except for her. A medic's hands worked on him under fire, quick and steady. Her face had been hidden behind a bloodied mask, but her voice had cut through the noise, steady, composed, telling him he was going to make it. He had held on to that voice like a lifeline. Until now, he thought he'd imagined it. At that moment, the harsh clatter of laughter snapped him back to reality. The contractors were at it again. Hey, Frankenstein, Chad sneered as Sarah walked by, balancing a tray. My eggs are cold. Maybe if you stopped limping around like a busted wind-up doll, they'd actually get here warm. Sarah didn't flinch. She stood firm, her back straight despite the venom in his voice. I'll have the cook make you a fresh plate, she said calmly, reaching for the dish. Don't touch it with those mangled hands, another man added, his words thick with revulsion. Who knows what kind of diseases you're carrying? The cruelty punched through the air like a slap. Conversations halted. Forks froze midair. Even the regulars, who'd learned to turn a blind eye, looked up, unease flickering across their faces. A young child nearby, untouched by the weight of adult prejudice, peered up at Sarah with curious eyes. Lady, did it hurt? He asked, pointing at the scars winding down her arms. Sarah paused, her expression softening. She crouched slightly, meeting his gaze, not as much as being forgotten. She said gently, words so quiet and honest they lingered in the air long after she'd stood back up. Michael's pulse quickened. That voice, the same calm in the storm, the same quiet dignity. He rose from his booth before his thoughts could catch up, crossed the floor with a soldier's certainty. She was just finishing wiping the contractor's table when he stopped a few feet away. Excuse me, he said, his tone respectful, almost reverent. She looked up, noting the bearing in his stance, the unmistakable imprint of military service. Yes, she replied. His eyes flicked to her forearm again, where more of the tattoo was now visible. That ink, he said quietly. 3rd to 5th Infantry. You were in Iraq? The words lingered like a flare in the air. For Sarah, it was the moment. She'd spent years bracing for the one where a stranger would see through the scarred skin. And polite smiles, and no. She hesitated, then something in Michael's gaze recognition. Not pity made her nod or to tours. She said simply, "Medic." Michael's face paled, his breath shaky. The puzzle was snapping together, piece by piece. "Ramadi," he said. 2006, IED en route Michigan. "You were the one who what?" She asked softly, though her intuition already knew where this was going. "Who saved my life," he said, emotion thickening his voice. "Corporal Michael Kelly, 2nd Battalion. You pulled me out of that Humvee. Kept me breathing for 40 minutes, until the medevac landed." The diner had gone still, the usual hum of morning chatter falling into silence. Even the contractors who'd been so quick with cruelty now sat wordless, watching something they couldn't mock or diminish. Sarah's eyes studied his face, and slowly, a flicker of memory awakened. Recognition settled in. "You had shrapnel in your chest," she whispered. "You kept asking about your team." Michael nodded, his eyes glossy. "They made it home, every single one of them. Because of you." The air in the diner shifted, thick with the weight of revelation. The people who'd spent months quietly witnessing Sarah's humiliation now stared at her with a dawning sense of shame. The contractors, so sure of their dominance, looked small and deeply unsure. Michael reached up, removed his Marine Corps cap, and placed it over his heart. The gesture, wordless and heavy with meaning, filled the space between them like a salute. The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was sacred. ***. "Sergeant Miller," Michael said loudly, making sure every soul in the diner heard him. "Thank you for saving my life." The words dropped like a thunderclap. Silence fell so completely over Mel's roadside diner that the gurgling hiss of the coffee machine suddenly seemed deafening. Sarah didn't move. The walls of secrecy she had so carefully built, brick by silent brick, were beginning to crack. Every head turned toward her, the hum of conversation dying out as the weight of what had just been revealed settled over the room. Chad and the other contractors at the corner booth looked stunned, like they'd been punched in the gut. The realization hit hard. They had spent weeks mocking, belittling, and harassing a woman who had served with bravery most of them couldn't begin to understand. A woman who had saved lives in one of the most dangerous war zones on Earth. Their crude jokes about her scars, their snide remarks about her appearance, the shameful laughter, all of it laid bare as cruelty hurled at a veteran. A woman who had once worn the uniform with quiet pride and had walked through hell so others could live. One of them spoke, his voice weak, struggling to reconcile what he now knew. You were really in the military?" Sarah's voice was steady, but soft, her posture unshaken. "I'm not a hero," she said, almost apologetically. "I just did my job." Michael wasn't about to let her deflect. Not now. Not after everything. "Your job," he echoed, voice rising with emotion. "Your job was to run into the chaos while the rest of us prayed we'd make it out. You dragged wounded men out of burning Humvees, patched up torn bodies under sniper fire, and kept fighting when you should have been on the next bird home. Don't call that just a job. That's bravery most people will never even witness, let alone carry out." At the far end of the diner, an elderly couple, regulars for years, rose from their booth. The husband took off his cap and placed it gently over his heart. "Thank you for your service, Sergeant," the wife said, her voice trembling with emotion. "We're sorry we never knew." It was like a dam broke. People around the diner exchanged glances, their faces slowly turning from confusion to guilt. They remembered the times Sarah had been laughed at, the moments they heard but didn't intervene, the cruelty they'd witnessed and chosen to ignore. The trucker at the counter let his newspaper fall to the side. "We should have stepped in," he murmured, voice heavy with regret. "We should have had her back." From the kitchen, Bob Johnson, the diner's manager, emerged slowly. He had been listening from behind the door, and now stood in full view. His face flushed red, not from the heat of the stove, but from the burn of shame. He approached her, eyes avoiding hers at first. "Ma'am," he said, voice uncharacteristically formal, "you're off the clock for the rest of the day, with pay. And I want to be absolutely clear, anyone who ever disrespects you again in this place won't be." Served a damn thing. They'll be shown the door. Chad and the others sat in silence, the reality of their behavior finally dawning on them. It was no longer a joke, no longer harmless teasing. It was harassment, disrespect, cruelty toward someone who had quietly carried the weight of sacrifice every day. We didn't know. Chad muttered helplessly, all trace of arrogance gone. Sarah looked at him, her eyes calm but firm. If you had known I was a veteran, would it have made a difference? Her voice was quiet, but it cut deeper than any shout. Should someone need to earn your basic decency by wearing a uniform? The question hung in the air like smoke. No one dared to answer. It didn't need a reply. People shifted uncomfortably in their seats, thinking not just about Sarah, but about the strangers they walked past every day. How many others had stories no one bothered to ask about? How many were carrying silent burdens, quietly enduring while the world passed them by? Michael stepped closer, a quiet but solid presence beside her. You don't owe anyone anything, he said gently. You've already given more than enough. But Sarah wasn't just confronting the room, she was confronting herself. For 3 years, she had kept her past locked away, hidden beneath long sleeves and practiced silence. It was easier that way, easier to avoid the questions, the pity, the awkward thanks. Now that silence was gone, and with it, the scars she once saw, as reminders of pain, were being recast by others, and maybe eventually by herself as proof of strength, as symbols of survival, as honors earned in blood and fire. I just wanted to be left alone, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I just wanted to work, live quietly. I didn't want to explain myself to anyone. Michael nodded, not pressing her. And you shouldn't have to. But maybe now that it's out, maybe things can be different. Maybe you can finally get the respect you always deserved. Round them, the diner had changed. Whispers moved like wind through the booths. She's a vet. I heard she saved people in Iraq. All that time, right here. Michael stood steady, shielding her in his own way, anchoring her to the moment. She was no longer invisible, no longer just the scarred woman serving coffee and pie. Sergeant Miller, he said again, gently this time, voice rich with meaning. I know this isn't how you wanted it to happen, but maybe it's what needed to happen. Sarah glanced around the diner, really seeing it for the first time, not just the chipped linoleum and faded booths, but the faces of the people who had watched her pour coffee and clear plates for 3 long years without ever truly knowing who she was. The elderly couple near the window, who had once thanked her for her kindness, now looked at her with teary-eyed reverence. The long-haul trucker who'd always flirted a little too casually now nodded at her with unmistakable respect. Even Bob Johnson, the owner who had treated her like just another hand on the payroll, seemed different, humbled. And the contractors, they were gathering their things, leaving behind untouched breakfasts and the smugness they'd worn like armor. Their once joking glances were now heavy with guilt and awkward realization. Chad, who had earlier led the mockery, approached with hesitant steps and eyes that couldn't quite meet hers. Gone was the bravado, in its place, something closer. To shame, ma'am, he began, voice unsteady. I want to apologize. What we said, what we did, there's no excuse. We were wrong, and we're sorry. Sarah looked at him for a long beat, her gaze searching his face not for perfection, but for sincerity. And when she saw it painful, real, she nodded. Once, apology accepted, she said quietly. But remember this feeling. The next time you're about to judge someone by what you see on the outside, stop and think. The silence in the diner grew thick, charged with the weight of truth, of understanding too long delayed. Then Michael rose from his seat, his presence commanding attention without asking for it. His voice, steady and seasoned with the calm of someone long accustomed to leadership, cut through the quiet like a clarion call. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, turning slowly to face the room. I want you to understand exactly who this woman is. He looked to Sarah, and something in his eyes, part reverence, part something deeper, held the entire room in its grasp. Sergeant, Sarah Miller didn't just serve in Iraq, he said. She was one of the most decorated medics in her unit. He paused, the memory taking shape before him. She saved my life. March 15, 2006. Our convoy was hit by an IED just outside Ramadi. I was unconscious, bleeding out. Sarah worked on me for 40 minutes under direct enemy fire. Until medevac could reach us, the air seemed as still as he spoke. The sound of cooking from the kitchen, suddenly a distant hum, as if the building itself had gone silent to listen. But that wasn't the only life she saved. Not by far. During the full tours, Sergeant Miller treated over 100 wounded soldiers. She earned a Purple Heart for wounds sustained in combat, a Bronze Star with a V device for valor, and more importantly, she earned the unshakable respect of every soldier who ever served beside her. Sarah felt something shift inside her. For the first time in years, she couldn't fight the tears stinging her eyes. She had lived so long in the shadows, so long hiding behind uniforms of another kind aprons. Not fatigues that to hear her truth spoken aloud felt both surreal and deeply, achingly validating. Michael stepped closer, his voice growing stronger, steadier. The scars you see on her arms, her face, those aren't flaws. They're not something to pity or mock. They are the proof of courage. They are the visible signs that when her country called, she answered. That when others ran from gunfire, she ran toward it to save lives. When an explosion threatened to take mine, she threw herself over me to shield me from the blast. In the back booth, the elderly woman sobbed quietly into her husband's chest. He held her, his own eyes glassy. Round the diner, people wiped at their faces, no longer trying to pretend they weren't moved. Bob Johnson stepped forward, clearing his throat. His usual brusqueness softened. "Sergeant Miller," he said, voice rough with emotion, "you've got a job here for as long as you want it, and I swear, anyone who disrespects you under this roof will answer to me." Just when it seemed the emotion had reached its peak, the bell above the door jingled. A young soldier stepped inside, still in his crisp dress uniform, clearly on his way to a new duty post. He froze, instantly grasping the weight of what he'd walked into. Without hesitation, he came to attention, boots together, and saluted. "Ma'am," he said formally, "it's an honor to meet you. Thank you for your service and your sacrifice." Sarah, stunned, felt her body respond before her mind caught up. She returned the salute sharp, clean, muscle memory kicking in from another life. It was the first time she'd done it since the day she was medically discharged. The motion felt foreign and yet, at the same time, deeply right. Like a bridge to a version of herself she thought had been lost forever. Then Michael pulled out his wallet. Slowly, reverently, he took out a photograph, its edges worn, the image faded with time. "I've carried this for 17 years, he said, offering it to her. "This was our squad, taken just days before that attack, every face in. This picture made it home, because of medics like you." She looked down at the photo, 12 young soldiers frozen in time, full of cocky grins and shining eyes. Her chest ached, not with sorrow, but with something more powerful, vindication, healing. She had never asked for recognition. She had never needed it. But standing in that diner, with the community seeing her clearly for the first time, Sarah Miller finally felt seen. ***. The sense of youth and the unspoken brotherhood of shared service. Sarah recognized it instantly. It was the kind of photo soldiers tucked into duffel bags and families framed with pride. A snapshot that meant more than medals ever could. The kind of image only someone who had truly been there would understand. "I never thought I'd find you," Michael said, his voice trembling slightly. "Not a day's passed since Romani that I haven't wondered, did you make it? Were you okay? Were you happy, seeing you here, alive? Standing in front of me, it's like something I've prayed for. And today that prayer was finally heard." That moment of reckoning cracked open something long buried in Sarah. For the first time in 3 years, she allowed herself to speak freely, not as a waitress, not as a civilian, but as a soldier, a healer, a woman who had carried a battlefield inside her long after the war ended. No more hiding behind quiet smiles or shrugged off scars. She spoke not just of what she'd done, but what it had meant. "I loved being a medic," she said, each word growing steadier. "I loved knowing that what I did mattered, that I could be the reason someone got to go home to their family. When I was discharged, losing that sense of purpose hurt more than any injury ever did. And with that confession, Something shifted not just in the room, but in the town. In that diner, a dam broke, and from it flowed a deep current of understanding. Sarah's truth echoed through the community like a ripple across still water, touching lives far beyond the cracked linoleum floor where she had once served pancakes in silence. Half a year later, the resonance of that morning still lingered like the scent of fresh coffee in the air. Mel's roadside diner had become something more than a pit stop. It was now a beacon. Veterans came from miles around, drawn by whispers of the combat medic who poured coffee with the same quiet strength she'd once used to stop bleeding under fire. Sarah, once uneasy with her sudden visibility, found herself slowly embracing it not as a burden, but as a bridge. Veterans arrived, some with canes, others with stories, all seeking that rare feeling of being truly seen. Sarah listened to each of them with a nod, a hand on a shoulder, a few simple words that carried the weight of shared understanding. "I used to think silence was healing," she'd say, her gaze steady, "but it turns out, speaking my truth has done more for me than years of therapy ever did." Michael became a familiar face, stopping by whenever his travels brought him near. What had begun as a bond forged in combat grew into something lasting, a friendship rooted in mutual respect and the knowledge that some connections defy explanation. Even Chad and his crew, the ones who once ridiculed her, were not immune to change. They had stood before her in the same booth where they'd once smirked and offered a public apology that brought tears to more than one set of eyes. But they hadn't stopped there. They launched a fundraiser for local veterans services, pulling in over $15,000 to support the very people they had once mocked. "Meeting Sergeant Miller changed how I look at people," Chad later told a reporter. "It made me realize you never know what someone's carried or what they've given up." Bob Johnson, the diner's owner, took it further. He started a Veterans Eat Free program on national holidays. He created a wall of honor inside the restaurant, a quiet tribute to the men and women who had served, complete with framed photos and handwritten notes that turned customers into neighbors and neighbors into family. The story of the waitress, with the scarred hands and the steady gaze, spread beyond county lines. First, the local paper picked it up, then national outlets. Soon, towns across America were launching their own recognition programs, inspired by the idea that heroes aren't always in uniform. Sometimes they're pouring your coffee, sweeping the floor, or serving up eggs and a smile. Most importantly, Sarah found herself again not in the shadow of who she had been, but in the light of who she still was. She began volunteering at the local VA clinic, applying her medical training to help fellow veterans navigate a system that often left them lost. Her time on the battlefield had prepared her in unexpected ways that made her indispensable to those struggling to transition back into civilian life. "I thought my service ended when I was discharged," she told a room full of veterans during a local event, "but now I see it never ended. Service isn't just about the uniform. It's about what you do with what you've lived through. It's about using your strength to lift others up." Once just a waitress people barely noticed, Sarah had become something else, a quiet symbol of unrecognized valor. Her story reminded people to look twice, to listen better, and to remember that courage often walks among them in silence, waiting only for someone to look close enough to see it. And when they did, entire communities discovered not just a hero but a healing they didn't know they needed.